Добрий день, шановні колеги. Розпочинаємо нас.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Our next briefing is about the freedom of currency exchange operations. And the question we ask ourselves is when the freedom of these transactions be materialized. And we have among the participants the Emal Bakhtari, head of the projects and programs of the National Bank of Ukraine, and Taras Kachka, strategic advisor to the Renaissance International Foundation, and Maria Repko, the deputy executive director of the Center for Economic Strategy, and Mr. Roman Shpek, who is the moderator. He is the chairman of the board of the Independent Association of Ukrainian Banks. Ladies and gentlemen, we have gathered today in order to assess the progress of reforms in the financial sphere. We have received the feedback and the texts, in fact, of the directives of or resolutions of the National Bank of Ukraine on the development of the new law on foreign currencies in Ukraine, and we are going to assess them. Let me say right at the beginning that these three drafts have not yet the ones that make this freedom of currency exchange operations real. We hope that will be done in the future. But we are now going to assess what are the policies in terms of foreign currency exchange operations and transactions, and what are the conditions in which we operate. Now, we as the practical bankers are very much interested in the progress in this sphere, because these new pieces of legislation would require the, so to say, restructuring of their operational systems in the banks, and there will be a great chunk of work for the IT specialists and IT departments of all the banks, and that work should be done on time, so that there will be no delays in the implementation of these changes that would be brought about by these new regulatory documents. So what my questions are to the experts, how do they view these documents, and what are the changes in this regulatory policy in this realm? My first question is to Ms. Repko. Well, thank you for your participation in this meeting on the foreign currency exchange operations regulations. We have been involved in this since 2001, and we have heard lots of complaints from the foreign banks and foreign financial institutions that the financial regulations, financial activities regulation are very cumbersome in Ukraine. They impede, put obstacles especially for the foreign banking institutions and financial institutions. We are calling on the government to liberalize this sphere, and we, with the involvement of a lot of stakeholders in the form of private commercial banks and different other financial institutions, we call on them to be more active, as we now have this window of opportunity to bring these changes about, and having this is the period of time when we can yet preempt, so to say, or somehow shape out the changes that we require, because otherwise we will just have the final results, the documents that would be binding by law, and then it would be too late to change anything. What do we see as the necessary parameters of these documents? The first issue is to make financial regulations in Ukraine, and a regulatory regime in the financial area, in the financial sphere in Ukraine, compliant with the provisions of the association agreement with the European Union. For example, the financial services segment of the financial market. Now we have the provision, or we are seeking to implement a provision, or to put in place in provision the opportunity for the European banks to the Ukrainian citizens and for the Ukrainian banks to provide financial services to the citizens of the EU countries. A lot of financial services are under question here, like, for example, the currency exchange, foreign currencies exchange operations, and so on and so forth. So this is the basic level of this regulation and regulatory changes on the trans-border exchanges, currency exchanges. We have not yet seen in the draft, frankly, any improvements. And the Ukrainian law states it quite unambiguously, or rather, we want to give an opportunity to in today's regulation, the foreign banks can only be, if they want to operate in Ukraine, can only be the agents of the banks or the clients of the banks of Ukrainian financial institutions. We need to change that so that it's liberalized, this regime is liberalized. I hope that this would facilitate the export operations from Ukraine into European countries. And it would also be conducive to Ukraine's further integration into the global financial system. Although some people warn against potential drawbacks in the form of the high volatility of Ukrainian currency vis-a-vis major foreign currencies, we think that it could be avoided by introducing new prudential regulations and norms. The other stakeholders, among whom we have the banks and financial companies, financial firms of different sorts, they also are interested in somehow resolving the issue of the documents that are required for any transaction, financial transaction involving foreign currencies. I think it could be resolved through, rather in the form of recommendations, rather than keeping these norms as binding, these limitations binding, those that exist now. So I would certainly join Mr. Roman's view of this need to speed this process up so that the banks also have enough time to get ready to transform and restructure their own capacities in order not to disrupt financial operations and the functioning of the financial system. Yes, I would only add that the draft law does not touch upon the activities of the foreign banks in Ukraine at all yet. So maybe we at the National Bank, for example, should review this and look at how Ukraine can implement its commitments with regard to, the best practices existing in European countries, so that the existing regulations are not terminated, but at the same time the association agreement provisions are somehow incorporated into or added into the existing Ukrainian legislation. I would like to start by reminding you about the financial services part of the association agreement. It's a fairly complicated matter, especially if the context is international. Here in the association agreement, we have two dimensions. One is the so-called starting position, which is the level of access that Ukraine provides to the other countries, the EU countries, and vice versa. This regime does not differ significantly from the regimes that are provided for by the World Trade Organization provisions, and it has remained unchanged essentially since 2008. But in the course of the negotiations, when we view the movement of capital norms, I'd say that this issue has been a key during the discussion of this part of the association agreement. So the financial services is one of the areas in which practically 100% integration of Ukraine's financial system into that of the European Union is provided for. There are only 4 such areas. It's transportation, it's energy, and financial services is one of those 4 areas. It's been always important for Ukraine. It's been attractive for Ukrainian financial institutions to get as close as possible to the European Union financial markets so that they could operate freely there, and also maybe draw some financial investments from the EU countries. But when we speak about the existing directives and their drafts, we have a nuance. Here in the EU, all the directives with regard to the banks and financial institutions' activities, they are based upon the notion of the freedom of movement of the capitals among the countries. Therefore, this is the basis, so to say, for any deregulation of financial markets. Therefore, the foreign currency operations regulations is very important. And on it depends this implementation or non-implementation of the provisions of the association agreement. So in the course of the negotiations between the National Bank, especially that part of these negotiations that preceded the adoption of that law on foreign currency operations. So we talk about the period of 2008, 2010. It introduced, that law introduced after that crisis of 2008, rather severe, rather strict limitations. And when we started negotiating the association agreement with the European Union, we confronted this set of limitations that resulted from the crisis of 2008. So as of today, we can say that the situation we have now is that we have not yet implemented the provisions of the association agreement in 100%. Entirely, but we hope that we are in the process of movement towards closer integration with the financial markets of the European Union, and it is important to keep these limitations that we still have until the time when we could merge closer with the European financial markets, like, let's say, in 5 or 7 years on. So it's the dynamic of our relations with the European Union. We need to bear in mind this need that this association agreement should be adhered to. But, you know, the law is the document where, you know, that establishes or determines the whole architecture of financial services. Therefore, when we are putting the key elements, the bricks, so to say, we are constructing this building of the renovated financial regulations in Ukraine, we need to bear in mind this need to gradually remove these limitations, those restrictions that were introduced in the previous law. My impression is that that's the path that practically all the countries that were joining the European Union, they followed upon that path of the removal of gradual amalgamation of their financial services regulatory regimes with that of the European Union. So we probably need to get used gradually to the EU norms and provisions and try to put them into the regulations and regulatory documents of Ukraine. So we need to bear in mind that all of the good and positive intentions that we have, we need to put also into the documents, at least issued by the National Bank of Ukraine, which is the central bank of this country. So all these aspects should be clearly reflected in the new regulatory documents. Thank you, Taras. We also need to remember how much the European Union regulations in terms of compliance, for example, and the other aspects of financial services have changed in the European Union itself since the time of the signing of this association agreement in 2014. So the matter is that not only should the National Bank of Ukraine be reformed and its policies, but also the economy of the country itself. When we have the financial situation in Ukraine, this country determined by the salaries paid, so to say, in the shadow, in the some shadow forms. Not all salaries are made public for the purposes of taxation, tax avoidance, and therefore we need to see this. This unanimity, so to say, or rather uniform approach. What we need is a uniform approach on the part of all the stakeholders, all the interested parties. And certainly the government's approach to these structural reforms is very important. I absolutely agree with you, 100% agree with you. But what I would like to draw your attention to is that when we speak about the implementation of the association agreement, we sometimes have the BEX aspect or compliance aspect is more important. We need to remember all of them. Yes, it is true, but we need to remember that the banking sector of any country that tries to integrate itself into the European Union cannot be taken as the only sector of its economy. It's only a part of the overall economic structure of the country. Yes, absolutely true. And we have a lot of examples with other sectors of the economy, like power production, for example. In many respects, I agree with you. It's sort of catch-22, as it is called. But at a certain stage, we need to try to introduce these changes that would remove some of the limitations, some of the impediments. And therefore, I say that these provisions, these approaches should be put into the documents, specific documents, regulatory documents. Yes, and it's important to remember the revolutionary versus evolutionary path. Not a single revolution has implemented fully the goals that its organizers declared at the beginning of any revolution. Well, when I came here, when I was coming here, I was thinking of, probably some heated and very controversial discussion, full of controversy. But I have heard here so far some very sound ideas. And I can say that in the previous years, our company, for example, as a foreign country operating in Ukraine, we have bumped into a lot of obstacles in terms of compliance to the Ukrainian legislation regulations. And there were instances when the law enforcement officials in Ukraine were pressurizing us unlawfully. And we were quite unhappy. We have been quite unhappy for a long time with the pace of changes in Ukraine. In 2013, when these events on the Maidan Square, as it's now renamed, when they started, we were full of hopes again. But we now see that the situation is much more complicated, rather than just a quick revolutionary change everywhere, of everything and everywhere. Speaking about the changes for the foreign currency exchange operations, I'd say that we still live through difficult times, and it's related also to a number of other sectors of economy where where businesses who need currency exchange. Transactions to go quickly, they still experience difficulties. We also need to take into account the fact that the banks in different countries are with greater and greater ease open accounts to the foreign businesses operating in their territory. And even to physical persons, individuals, and therefore we are most and foremost interested in the integration into a global financial system from the point of view of establishing a company, registering it with all the needed authorities. The other concern of us is the PEP situation, especially for the Ukrainian businesses, remains quite complicated. If in the other countries you have the situation that the internal regulations, they somehow limit more and more the risks of involvement of money laundering. Here in Ukraine, it's on the contrary. This risk has, in my view, grown. And these provisions, these PEP provisions, they have not been implemented and are not being implemented in are not being introduced into any Ukrainian regulatory documents. Well, this is not true, believe me. The banks here in Ukraine are interested in introducing these provisions because the banks are being punished they can be punished for any violations of these provisions. By PEP, we use this abbreviation for politically exposed persons. And yet before the law that we mentioned was adopted, I spoke to the Ministry of Justice. We discussed with them this absurdness of having the lists of politically exposed persons up to 300,000 people, as it is here in Ukraine. What happens in practice is that For example, the banks are given one list of these persons, then the bank examiners from the National Bank come or rather the inspectors from the National Bank come to a commercial bank, and they have a list that is entirely different, of which we are not aware, being, the commercial bankers. And the banks are punished for any violations, if any are found. The chairman of the board is punished. For example, recently, a chairman of the board of one of the banks was recently dismissed. He lost his job after the compliance violations were found. He was accused of, not doing anything in order to prevent it. So when we speak about all of these aspects, about these enormous lists of people, yes, that's what I meant, basically. The international banks, they have a system in place where you can make a request and you automatically receive the information on that request. In Ukraine, it's inexistent. But what we need as a business, what result would we like to see? We would like to see the situation in which, when we come to a bank, what happens in Europe? We come to a European bank, we say that we have a joint venture with a Ukrainian company, we want to open an account. For example, you have, if you already have an account open at, let's say, UBS, in Germany, you would easily, your account could be easily opened by any German bank, because they are sure that if they see that you have a UBS account, the UBS has good procedures, and therefore you are trustworthy. In Ukraine, the majority of the entrepreneurs, for example, they had to close their accounts, bank accounts, in the United States, because in one of the regulatory documents, international, obviously, regulatory financial documents or American financial documents, Ukraine was recognized as an unsafe, so to say, country whose financial transactions should be somehow supervised more closely and probably restricted. That is the problem for us, and that's why we want better integration into the into the international financial system. I suggest that we now listen to a representative of our regulatory body. Maybe after his presentation or after his talk, we could discuss, we could have more food, so to say, for discussion. Thank you for this opportunity to speak to you. What is positive, the first notion that I would like to point out is that we have no ideological, so to say, divergencies or even contradictions. We are discussing the better or the best ways of doing this or that, to making this improvement or the other improvement. The next positive thing is that a lot of criticism has been expressed on financial monitoring issues. I do not specifically deal with that issue, but I will certainly tell my colleagues who deal with financial monitoring about that. And we certainly cooperate with them, but we also know that the financial monitoring's role grows wherever the limits and restrictions are removed or weakened. being guided by this desire that you also indicated, that the Ukrainian banking system be trusted, I think that the National Bank can help, but also the commercial banks by their compliance could also help. It's not only the National Bank of Ukraine's cup of tea. Getting back to what Maria mentioned, I see no problem yet with the directives or resolutions of the National Bank of Ukraine. Resolutions are a regulatory document, but it's not a law. And when you have a bill that needs to be approved by the parliament, you know how difficult sometimes it is, and that was the case with the previous law on banking activities, how difficult it was to get it through the parliament. And the National Bank of Ukraine's regulations, they are its internal, so to say, documents, and the bank can amend them and change them at any time. As soon as we reach an agreement, we see the need for any changes, and we can do that together with you. We have no divergences in this view of the need of closer integration with the European Union's financial system, and we as the regulator can discuss this option of better access of foreign banks to Ukrainian financial market. The thing is, what could be the best format? Do they need to open here their branches, or maybe just corresponding accounts, and not the banking license or banking activities license would not be necessary? So we need to discuss that, and I'm sure that the discussion of this aspect, and also of the role of non-banking financial institutions, foreign and non-banking financial institutions in Ukraine, should also be discussed, because we as of today, the functions of the National Bank of Ukraine in terms of foreign currency operations is limited to only giving the licenses for these transactions, the buying and selling of foreign currencies. But our role is to see to it that there are no negative impact for the financial and economic system of the country from these resulting from these foreign exchange operations. And we are also, rest assured that we as the National Bank are also convinced and interested in having all these proper regulations in place and maximally corresponding to the interests and needs of the various banking institutions. But I hope that the documents that we have discussed now and commented on, they're going to be published at the beginning of next month, I hope. And we are transparent here. We want you to take a look at these, at the drafts of these documents, and they will be open for discussion, for your comments. And we are open to discussing with you any other aspects that you might be interested in with regard to financial services, any aspect of financial services in this country. Thank you. Thank you. Speaking about the foreign banks operating in Ukraine, I think that, for example, the amount of currency reserves, foreign currency reserves, according to the provisions of the IMF programs, cooperation with IMF programs, it should be by now $38 billion. But Ukraine's main, criteria being this indicator of the three quarterly amounts of exports and proceeds from these exports. That's the problem for the foreign currency reserves as well. I would like to comment on this, adherence, or rather the correspondence of the documents of the National Bank. The clear stream was declared, the appearance of the clear stream system was declared. If a large foreign investor comes into Ukraine, and if this company, for example, would like to open an account at a Ukrainian bank, I have difficulties in imagining how it could practically be done, because if a broker that represents that foreign investor would buy through this clear stream system the foreign currencies. And another comment on the bill on foreign currencies operations, foreign currency exchange operations. I think it should be more practical. In Article 4 of the existing law, the residents of Ukraine have the right to open the accounts in foreign banks located in the territories of foreign countries. How would their cooperation would be organized? Like, for example, Denis's company, would it be able to open an account at, let's say, BNP Paribas or any other foreign bank? I'm not sure that these provisions, they clearly regulate these opportunities. Well, our problem is that we cannot, we have no rights to influence, to make any effect on their activities. We can only give a license for them if they are compliant with all the other requirements, and let them work. Our task, as we see it, is to deregulate, but certainly not eliminating the stop gaps, so to say, and checks against unlawful activities, to simplify these operations with with stocks and bonds, with different types of securities, with foreign securities and foreign currencies, and so on. With the existing regime, we want to simplify the existing financial supervision and regulatory regime, but if, for example, there are some limitations are yet in place, for example, the amounts of foreign currencies to be bought are regulated, or the repatriation of capitals from the country are somehow regulated. Certainly, we need to think again and again of whether they should be kept in place, because if some of these provisions could easily be circumvented, whether we need to have them at all in our laws. Maybe we need to make things more effective and simple enough, so that it is comfortable, the legislative environment is comfortable enough for the businesses to operate. The other thing is, or another thing is that even after the adoption of these bills and these documents that we have mentioned, I foresee that, for example, a number of laws should be amended in accordance with this new law, so that the best practices that they have in the European Union are introduced, and the new rules on reporting, and on the MiFID II provisions, so that the financial monitoring cannot be, avoided, and so that some fictitious contracts that contain, corruptive elements could be detected and, somehow prevented. So it's a great portion of work that remains to be done yet. Why are you hasting us up? Aren't you pleased to stay with us? No, on the contrary. But as we, have developed this, I think, positive approach to the need of, making all the components of financial control and supervision not become an impediment, so to say, an obstacle to financial activities. So we need to avoid the situation when one simplification measure does not invoke or does not create the whole chain of complications, which was the case, for example, with the stamps, the elimination to use the rubber stamps as a necessary component of validation of documents. When they were abolished, the whole set of problems arose. So when we speak about the implementation of the European Union regulations of the financial services in Ukraine and vice versa, we need to think about how they are implemented in Ukraine. And the colleague mentioned already that there are certain, shortcomings when a person can be invited to open a bank account here, a foreign business, and then when they come to a bank, they face this situation with the PEP lists and so on and so forth. So all these aspects like anti-laundering, anti-money laundering measures and anti-corruption measures, all these aspects should be taken into account when we improve our regulatory documents and pieces of legislation. Therefore, each of these new steps in deregulation should be viewed in conjunction with not only the existing legislation of the European Union, but also with vis-à-vis all the other aspects and components of the financial services legislation. So, but again, adhering to this association agreement, we certainly have better means of communicating with the European Union regulatory authorities and improve the treatment, so to say, of the Ukrainian businesses in the European Union countries. Thank you very much for this opportunity to address you, but I have to leave you now because I'm running out of time. Thank you. Let me say that the banks, commercial banks, in some of their internal documents, they do not implement even the National Bank of Ukraine's regulations in their internal documents. Again, I'm I'm talking about, for example, the export operations, import operations. For example, even after the decisions on simplification and reduction of the number of documents needed for foreign currency exchange operations in order to fund these export-import operations. Some of the banks, we faced that the situation when in some of the commercial banks, they didn't simplify their requirements. What we can do about it is that we can organize a meeting at the National Bank of Ukraine, invite the commercial banks, because today we have the situation of the struggle among the banks for the clients, and but it does not eliminate the risks. Some of the transactions could be high risk, viewed by the banks as high risk, the other as the low risk transactions. I understand that there are complications with regard to Russia, that is viewed as an aggressor country by many Ukrainian government. But as far as the other countries are concerned, I think we could hold discussions, and we recently held similar discussions with the representatives of agricultural businesses and the banking sector, and we are ready to meet the other sectors of economy operators. The situation is with the Ukrainian banks is that the banks that operate in Ukraine, they do their best. They're trying to do their best in order to understand all the nuances of Ukrainian legislation. But it's not always possible. Well, in my view, we have in some of our commercial banks the situations when the managers in charge of specific clients, they take more the side of the clients than of the bank itself. But it's we can deal with this problem, and in the end, it's up to the banks themselves how they deal with their employees. Questions and answers now. I heard from what you said, I draw a conclusion that financial monitoring rules are not going to be liberalized. Is that true? I think that if there is no further deregulation in this sphere and easing of these requirements, it will be difficult for the foreign businesses to operate in Ukraine. In Ukraine, the norm is still that one who wants to open an account at a Ukrainian bank, any foreign resident, any foreign company, they need to present the passports of their representatives with the mark of border crossing, of the fact of border crossing. In any other country, you can open a bank account remotely, so to say, electronically. Therefore, I think that in these aspects, with these controls, I think we even look quite outdated. And I had personally these situations when I was asked by a foreign partner to open an account for him here in Ukraine. When I told him that he needed to be here physically to cross the border and come here to this country, he excused himself and never returned to this request of opening a bank account here in Ukraine. Well, I would probably try to defend the Ukrainian, regulatory regime by saying that in the other countries there are certain requests. For example, if you have transactions of larger than certain amounts, like $200,000 a year. For example, in many countries, the provisions start working that are much stricter than those existing in Ukraine. I would like to also reflect on this set of issues with regard to a possibility of investment by foreign financial firms into Ukrainian government bonds. And here the problem is how to buy hryvnias. Some of the companies want to convert their currencies into hryvnias. And that is important for the Ukrainian foreign debt. Well, I'm not in a position now to comment on this financial monitoring provision that you referred to. But let me again tell you what is the logic of the Financial Monitoring Authority's approach to this problem. They would like to avoid the situation when some of the among the investors we have the people who are, so to say, undesirable as the investors in this country. For example, someone who is in this list that was mentioned. In the other respects, I think we should certainly follow the best practices of the European Union. And we are ready here and open to any contacts, any discussions, and we can discuss, the possibility of adapting Ukrainian financial system to the foreign businesses. But we need to take into account that we need to understand that if Ukraine weakens its financial monitoring requirements, it will be criticized again for, turning into a country which has become a safe haven or something. Well, what I'm talking about is the paper documents that are needed, like 3 documents in order to open an account. In foreign countries, it's a utility bill, it's a copy of a passport, and the ID document, some other ID document. In Ukraine, what is required are the true copies of each of the documents, personal documents, including the passport. And if it's a foreigner, he needs to have in his passport a stamp or a mark evidencing the crossing of the border, arriving into Ukraine. But I think that we need to abandon this norm. Otherwise, it's quite, quite unproductive. I can only say it again that we are an open organization. If your requests or complaints or claims are to the national bank as the regulator, we are certainly most open to discussing these claims and these requests and wishes and suggestions and so on. But you need to understand what were the reasons for some controls to be introduced, and then we can work out some common logic. Alexei, you represent business and he represents the National Bank, but you certainly can write a letter either directly to them or to our association, and we will forward it to the National Bank. We need to pass to the other questions, but for you, to clarify this situation, you need to put all your grievances, so to say, into a letter and then send it to us so that it can be reviewed and replied to. I have just, like Bashlinsky, I just have a small question with regard to what has just been said. I think that it's possible for the National Bank and the Anti-Corruption Bureau to get together and work out some bill on as it was done with the anti-laundering law, to make a bill on, on financial, on the other aspects of financial regulations with regard to foreign currencies operations, so that these accusations, of you operating following each entity and organization following its own interests, these accusations be removed somehow, because as of now this discussion seems to be a little bit not consistent enough. Yeah, we certainly are in favor of these discussions, and we only need for this discussion to be productive, to have a list of issues and questions that need to be reviewed. I would only like to add that to what has been said, that some of the banks, commercial banks, also react quite slowly. For example, this 1593 regulation, some banks still do not know about it, and the simplifications that it provides for. Therefore, if all the levels of Ukraine's financial system change and reform and restructure quicker, then this process would be better and quicker. Frankly, what happens today is that if you approach any of the foreign banking operators with the Ukrainian passport, they immediately suspect you of the intention of, make some exchange operations unlawfully, like using the electronic mask for your transaction and so on. So my idea is that we need to continue working in order to get the results as soon as possible. My question is about the regulations that the National Bank developed. For example, 2 or 3 years ago, the basis for this foreign currency operations regulatory regime was discussed. At that time, it was mentioned that some of the norms would be contradictory, would diverge significantly from the provisions and norms and requirements of the other countries' central banks and their financial systems. What we see today, all the documents that have already been adopted, they have been based on the Global Code of Conduct that was adopted last year by the Committee on Financial Stability. What can we see in our Ukrainian documents. The currency control, foreign currency controls and monitoring in Ukraine can be done according to the instruction of on currency control and cash flow documents. I will answer you shortly. Yes, thank you. And the second issue is the responsibility. In all the national bank's instructions, usually state in their last item that the responsibility is or follows or is imposed in accordance with the laws that are in effect in this country. And if we open any document like foreign transactions, foreign currency transactions documents in Korea, there are, for example, 10 pages of describing the responsibilities and sanctions, actually the punishments and disciplinary actions and so on and so forth for all sorts of violations of currency control measures. Why can't you do it similarly? And for example, your regulations can be compared to these big posters that you could see at the border crossings, like informing you about some rules. But you do not lay down the rules there. Well, as I have already said, we think that the regulations should not be burdening, but they should be sufficient. For example, we as a national bank, we are in charge of the rules, setting the rules for functioning of financial markets in the open manner. The other departments of the national bank add their own provisions on the financial monitoring and so on and so forth. And I just am not in a position to comment on the other parts of the documents of the other departments. Maybe they, in the course of this, of their work, they develop their regulations with these detailed lists of sanctions. But we, frankly, we are against putting these details into these three documents. What is important is not to add into these documents the provision or the formula that Ukrainian authorities and the Ukrainian parliament and government likes, and others when they write in the provisions that these or the other things can or cannot be done, and others, because that provides, the lack of compliance. We can get another issue, for example, the pricing, how the prices are formed. For example, none of the documents state that all the financial services should be priced as close as possible to the market prices. Compliance is always mentioned in all the rules related to financial markets. So any operation should be approached from the standpoint of compliance. That's my view. Yes, I understand this, and I can only say that if you have any specific proposals, like, for example, these lists of sanctions that you would like to have in our documents, you can write us and make this suggestion, make this proposal. Speaking about MiFID and the pricing and any other aspects, I have already mentioned that we have a lot of work remaining, and these documents, three documents, they do not exhaust this work. Probably my most important comment. You were saying that the regulatory system for financial markets would be modernized. It, for example, as soon as I open an instruction of the National Bank, I see the list of the things that I am entitled to do. Why do I need my rights stated there? You can just only state what is prohibited to do, the prohibitions. Well, it's very debatable, because some people see the lack of any information, as you made in your previous reference to these list of sanctions. Some people might say that it's not detailed enough and it's ambiguous. It only shows the fact that there are opposite views, like you are in favor of putting the rights, the others are putting the prohibitions, the others are for listing only the rights. And let's discuss it. Well, first of all, I'm glad that this discussion is quite constructive and this very open discussion with the representatives of the National Bank. Mr. Shpek, I think that when you mentioned this fact of 50% of shadow markets, our banks and the businesses are also are striving to get the financial regulation regime liberalized. Well, all these shadow operations, they again are the evidence of what I mentioned before, that it's not the banks, commercial banks or even national banks, they alone cannot win over, they cannot overcome and eliminate corruption. It's the matter for the whole economic and administrative and political system of the country. Yes, but certainly we should not speak about these global goals, but at least these electronic operations could be somehow simplified in foreign currencies. For example, I would like to have here in Ukraine the situation when, for example, a currency turnover in Ukraine, daily currency turnover in Ukraine would be 3 billion hryvnias a day, let's say, in 3 years. In the other countries, it is possible. So if we set these as our goals, these ambitious, provisions, then we can operate, and the businesses can operate easier. If, for example, JP Morgan could operate with hryvnia or trade hryvnia without coming to Ukraine, if we make this possible, I think it's good. If we declare our goals of, approaching Europe, our harmonization with Europe, let's do something about it. The colleagues have spoken, have mentioned a lot of reforms that have been successful in the last 5 years. I have an advantage of my age, and I can tell you that from my 25 years of experience, we are the only country that has been fighting for macroeconomic stability for 25 years. And we do not have a proper credit rating and thus investment rating. Certainly, the instruments, all the instruments should be involved in order to make the country's economy competitive and its currency stable. But with this financial situation, with the situation with liquidity of our economy, and with our life of the whole of our economy, from one tranche of the IMF loans to the other, our certainly possibilities are very limited. As the old rule says, there is nothing more permanent is in this life as something temporary. Why I mentioned BEP and the other aspects when we started discussing these three drafts of these documents, I mentioned, I was driving at the fact that our economy might not, resist the competition of the other economies and other financial systems of the other countries that are much more developed, much better developed than that of Ukraine. There was some joke about Polish zloty. Mr. Shpek says that we do not need Polish zlotys, but the passports should probably be changed. If I can make reference again to this decree 1593 of the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine that prohibited for the Ukrainian residents, both physical persons, individuals, and the businesses to make any foreign currency exchanges without the license of the National Bank. Later on, the progress here in this, with this document is rather impressive, because it was first practically abolished, and then the foreign currency exchange was decriminalized, because they even introduced at that time a criminal responsibility for the operations of exchange of large amounts of foreign currencies. So I hope that the trust is now much higher. Dear colleagues, any more questions? Sergei Shevchuk, you mentioned the fact that even as you view these draft documents, not everything was, not all the aspects that you wanted to put into them are there. What are these? Well, what I meant was that in the course of drafting these documents, we saw more and more aspects of which we thought that they would be, important, and we probably need to reflect them somehow in some other documents. For example, there was the criteria of the protection measures. It's not only the work of our department, but it also contains, these measures contain a lot of technical difficulties. So it all needs to be properly worked out. And we are doing our best, but we also would like to involve you in this discussion, to hear your feedback, your comments, because the time is pressing, and we ourselves are interested in having these documents in place as soon as possible. And I can even say that you as the National Bank have limited time, but we as the Commercial Association, we have enough time. What's your view of the implementation of the rate or pace of the implementation of the association agreement provisions into Ukrainian legislation and their implementation, practical implementation? I might tell you, because I was a witness to these negotiations, that the financial services part was negotiated quite quickly. In the other sectors, like, for example, poultry exports and so on, and the other economic sectors, these were debated for months and months and upon months. We were ready to introduce as many changes as possible, and we completed our part, our negotiations with the EU on that part quite quickly. I would say that the most important approach that we wanted to materialize in these documents, in the drafts of these documents, is simplification and deregulation. And we certainly wanted very much to avoid the situation when there would be contradictory, some contradictions arise from the elimination of or renovation of different norms. Dear colleagues, the time for which we are renting this hall is running out. Let us remember then that the key to liberalization is within within large scale restructuring and modernization.